podcast where we will explore the dark corners of our world, the weird, the creepy, and the strange. I'm your host, Eric Carrier. My co-host is Jessica Carrier. Thank you for joining us for a journey into the unknown. Let's get started with today's show. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I am Eric Carrier. I'm your host. This is the Prairieland Paranormal Podcast. I'm here as always with
Jessica Carrier, the co-host.
Yes. So a couple things that we wanted to mention here before we got started. First of all, we wanted to thank everyone that's been tuning in to each of our episodes so far.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We were looking at our analytics the other day, and it looks like we've got close to 600 RSS subscribers, and with only 3 episodes, and
that's amazing.
Yes, with only 3 episodes out, we are very, very happy with that. So thank you everyone for tuning in. We also want to thank everyone who's been joining us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. All of those accounts can be are linked through our website, which is www.prairielandparanormalpodcast.com, and you can find us on all of those social media sites. We also wanted to take a minute and to thank RJ Jenkins for sending us some artwork this week that we're going to feature with this and our next episode. RJ, thank you so much for sending the artwork. And
that artwork is appropriately creepy and wonderful at the same time.
And we are very, very happy to be featuring that artwork the next couple weeks here. So as we get started here, let me start with a question. Jessica, have you ever been gassed out of a room by noxious fumes?
I don't know if I can answer that question.
So, you can definitely answer that question because the answer is yes. We have 3 teenage boys and 2 girls, and it is not uncommon in this household to be gassed out. But this episode is not about Farmer John cookouts or Dutch ovens. It's actually about the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. This is a very interesting story that piqued my attention a few months ago as I was doing some research, and took place here in Central Illinois. So let's talk about the Mad Gasser. This story took place in 1944 in Mattoon, Illinois. Situated in Central Illinois, Mattoon was a sleepy farm community in 1944. With a population of about 16,000, the town thrived on agriculture and wartime industry. Surely no one expected anything unusual to happen there. But something very unusual did happen there. Starting in September 1944, for 2 weeks, citizens in this sleepy town came under attack of a mysterious phantom in black called the Mad Gasser. 1944 was a tumultuous year. The balance of the war had shifted to the Allies, and World War II would soon be coming to an end. D-Day had been a resounding loss for the Germans, and news outlets were reporting that in retaliation, Nazi forces may be planning gas attacks on American soil. Then, in September 1944, as summer faded into fall, there was a series of terrifying attacks in Mattoon where over 24 ordinary citizens became victims to noxious gas attacks in their own homes. All victims reported strange odors and strange symptoms, such as nausea and temporary paralysis. Citizens were gripped in fear. Was it Nazis? Was it a crazed lunatic? Was it a phantom? Or was it, as psychologists suggest, mass hysteria?
The attacks began early in the morning on August 31st. Urban Rafe woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange odor in his home. He was nauseous and the air was heavy. Initially, he was concerned that the pilot light on the stove might have gone out. He reported,
"There was a particular heavy odor in the bedroom, and at first I thought it was gas."
He awoke his wife, and she too was quickly overcome with nausea. Both laid in bed, partially paralyzed for the next hour and a half until the feelings left as quickly as they started. They had a guest in their home that night, and after finding out their guests had not experienced anything unusual, the Wraiths put the incident out of their minds. That's until a day later, when Urban picked up the local paper and read about gas attacks on Mrs. Kearney, her sister, and her 3-year-old daughter. The headline of the local paper read,
"Anesthetic Prowler on Loose. Miss Kearney and Daughter First Victims." The story continued. A prowler who used some kind of anesthetic or gas to knock out his intended victims was on the loose in Mattoon Friday night. Miss Kearney and her 3-year-old daughter, Dorothy Ellen, were victims of the anesthetic Friday night as they slept in bed at their home, 1408 Marshall Avenue. Both had recovered today, although Miss Kearney said her mouth and throat remained parched and her lips burnt from effects of whatever was used by the prowler, who was unsuccessful in getting into the house. The Kearney incident, which Urban had read about, occurred on September 1st. Miss Kearney was at her home with her sister and her 3-year-old daughter. The incident occurred about 11 p.m. in the evening. She reported,
"I first noticed a sickening sweet odor in the bedroom, but at the time I thought that it might be from the flowers outside the window. However, the odor grew stronger and I began to feel a paralysis in my legs and lower body. I grew frightened and screamed for Martha. She came in the bedroom, to which the door had been closed, and asked me what was the matter. I told her the sensation I had, but I was unable to move."
Her sister called the police from a neighbor's home, as she too had noted a noxious odor. By the time the police arrived, the incident had ended. The smell was gone, and Miss Kearney had recovered. The Kearneys' brush with death would not be over after the authorities left. Later that evening, Mr. Kearney arrived home late from his job as a taxi driver and found what he thought was a peeper outside a window of their home. He chased the lurker, but was unable to catch him. The police were called for the second time that night, and Mr. Kearney described the prowler as a tall man dressed in dark clothing with a tight-fitting cap. He was not aware of the evening's prior happenings. The Kearneys left their home for the night and slept at a friend's house.
The newspaper quickly got a hold of the story of the frightening attack, and soon Urban was reading about it. The paper speculated wildly that an attacker had used either chloroform or ether, or possibly a combination of the two, and was spraying the gas into the rooms of the sleeping victims. Urban, convinced that he and his wife had been gassed, immediately called the police. The local authorities arrived and investigated the Wraith household, but found no lingering smells or gas or any other evidence.
The police, who originally thought the attack on Miss Kearney had been a failed burglary, were forced to scrap their theory when none of the other attacks fit the hypothesis. The people of Mattoon were left confused and scared, and surely no one was sleeping easy in town after that. The next couple of days were quiet, but then everything erupted again on Tuesday, September 5th, when the local paper headline read, "Anesthetic Prowler adds a victim. Mrs. C. Cords burned. Ill 2 hours." Beulah Cords and her husband Carl had returned home the previous night at around 10 p.m. Beulah noticed a white piece of cloth a little larger than a handkerchief on her front porch. She picked it up, smelled it, and immediately became sick. "When I inhaled the fumes from the cloth, I had a sensation similar to coming in contact with a strong electric current. The feeling raced down my body to my feet, and then seemed to settle on my knees. It was a feeling of paralysis. My husband had to help me into the house, and soon my lips were swollen, and the roof of my mouth and my throat burned. I began to spit blood, and my husband called the physician. It was more than 2 hours before I began to feel normal again." The authorities were called, and the police searched the property and the surrounding area. Along with the cloth, they found a skeleton key and an empty lipstick container, the first tangible evidence of the case. Beulah concluded that the assailant meant to use the cloth and the chemicals to get rid of the family dog, who usually slept on the front porch. making the Cords' home easier to rob. The police sent the cloth to the state lab, but no chemicals were ever found on it.
The same night, at 11:15 p.m., just over an hour after the Cords had returned home, Mrs. Burrell had woken coughing and choking on fumes in her bedroom. She struggled from bed, collected her infant son in her arms, and ran to a neighbor's house where she called her husband George and then the Mattoon police to report the attack.
With little else to go on, Thomas Wright, the Mattoon Police Commissioner, contacted the Illinois Department of Public Safety on Wednesday, September 6th, to ask for their help in solving the case. In response, the IDPS sent Superintendent Richard Piper of the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, along with his assistant Francis Berry, to help them get to the bottom of things. Piper and Berry arrived in town the very next day, along with 2 FBI agents from the local Springfield branch. That night, the citizens of Mattoon, in a panic, started to gather into vigilante groups, with the intent to patrol the streets at night. However, back at the police station, despite the group's presence on the streets, numerous calls were still coming in reporting sightings and attacks. None of these encounters produced any evidence, and later, Chief Cole chalked many of the calls up to nerves. The paper, however, reported a very different story the next day. The headline read,
"Mad anesthetist strikes again, visits 2 more homes in the city during night."
The story went on to say,
The anesthetic prowler, who for a week has struck terror in the hearts of Mattoon residents, visited at least 2 more homes in the city Wednesday night and added 2 more victims, both women, to its growing list.
If anything, the paper downplayed the anesthetist's activities on September 6th, as there were actually up to 7 reports that night. At 10 p.m., Laura Junkin was retiring to her small apartment situated at the rear of the Big Four restaurant. As she entered her bedroom, she noticed a strange smell in the air that she described as cheap perfume. She then realized she had left her window open all day. Soon, she felt the familiar effects of the anesthetic as nausea washed over her and paralysis started to set in.
Then, an hour later, Linda Hendershot, who was only 11, and the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. R.E. Hendershot, suddenly became ill. Her worried parents called the police and reported that they had spotted a prowler outside their daughter's window just before the attack.
Next, at midnight, Miss Ardell Spangler woke to sickly sweet fumes which brought on immediate nausea that made her lips and throat burn.
An hour after 1 a.m., Fred Gable was the next to become ill. He woke up feeling extremely ill and vomited for nearly 2 straight hours. His neighbor Robert Daniels reported seeing a tall, thin man running through his yard away from Gable's house. The evening of attacks didn't end in Mr. Daniels' yard. The police responded to a report from Mr. Daniels' lawn, Mrs. Cody Taylor, and Miss Maxine and Francis Smith, who all experienced the effects of gas poisoning. This was the first of 4 attacks on Francis Smith and her sister, who would report attacks 4 nights in a row. Francis was the principal at the Mattoon grade school, and she and her sister lived together. They were both attacked for the 2nd time the very next night. They reported a blue smoke vapor that came through their window. Terrified, all they could do was lay there as the paralysis crept in.
That Friday saw a stinging editorial in the local paper in which they asserted that the local police force was not taking the report seriously and being too dismissive. The paper read,
"One of the principal difficulties throughout this has been the whole matter was taken too lightly. It was easy to say, 'Oh, it's just imagination,' and shrug the whole thing off with a disdainful air."
The paper also printed some editorials that expressed the general feeling of the local town members. One read,
"We used to think things only happened to those who were out on the streets or somewhere else outside their homes. But now there's no safety even in one's own home with all the doors locked. There are hundreds of women here that are left at home at night, alone, while their husbands are at work or in the service. I know one serviceman's wife was a lovely home, which she wanted to keep so her husband could come home to it. But since so many terrible things have happened, she's afraid to stay there with her little son. She is fortunate enough to have parents with whom to stay, but those who have nowhere else to go just live in fear each night, waiting for the daylight to come.
Richard Piper, the superintendent of the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, also held a press conference in which he stated, "The perpetrator of the attacks must be mentally unbalanced, but he is intelligent, possibly brilliant. The man is a nut." This certainly did nothing to calm the fears of the local citizens.
The attacks began again early on Friday. Leroy Cook, a taxi driver, called and reported smelling gas so strongly on DeWitt Avenue that he had to pull his car over. The odor seemed to be coming from the home of C.W. Driscoll. The police responded, but smelled no gas and found nothing unusual upon entering the premises.
2 hours later, in western Mattoon, far from the city center, Genevieve Haskell, her son, her friend, Miss Russell Bailey, and her sister, Catherine Tuzo, had all gathered together for safety. Later that night, all members of the house awoke at the same time with vomiting, stomach ache, and parched mouth and throat. Later that night, Frances Smith and her sister were attacked for the third time. She again reported smelling a flour-like gas and heard a strange buzzing noise that she believed came from the madman's gassing apparatus.
There was another series of attacks Saturday and Sunday night. The first was reported by Lewis Hardin, who called the police to report an attack on his sister-in-law, who was at his house sitting for a son. Again, the gas was reported as coming through a window and caused nausea and throat burning.
The second attack of the night was taken by the county sheriff, Leroy Boggs. The sheriff responded to a call out to a rural farm about 4 miles south of town. The farm belonged to Stuart Smith. Smith, his family, and a house guest reported they had escaped a gas attack and gone to a neighbor's house. The sheriff's office responded and found that a window screen had been slashed.
The next attack that night was reported by Mary and Kenneth Fitzpatrick. They lived back in Mattoon and reported being overcome by gas as they were playing cards late into the evening.
The final attack of the night was a fourth attack on Frances and Maxine Smith. Surely, the gasser must have had some strong feelings toward the Smith sisters to attack them 4 times in 4 nights. Mattoon was becoming a fiasco, and the level of panic was nearing frenzy levels. Despite armed police and citizens patrolling the city at night, the attacks seemed to escalate. It is not surprising that faith in the local police force was fading, as they didn't seem to have any clues to whom or what was causing all of this commotion. The local paper did not help the situation at all. They stoked the fire by renaming the attacker the Mad Gasser, and exaggerated the number of people who had been attacked. The citizens of Mattoon were desperate for answers. The newspaper, on Monday morning, printed the headline,
"Many prowler reports, few real."
The report read,
2 women, one residing in the 2300 block of Champaign Avenue, the other in the 800 block of Voltaire Avenue, were taken to Memorial Hospital for treatment and examination after they told the police that they had been attacked by the gas. The former woman claimed the attack had occurred at her home. The other said she smelled the gas as she sat in the theater. A physician who examined both women said that he could find no evidence of the poison gas or any other chemical, and in his opinion, both suffered from extreme nervous tension. Both women were given sedatives and taken to their homes.
The doctor's examination prompted Police Commissioner Thomas Wright to make an unprecedented move. From that point forward, he ordered that anyone calling the police concerning a gas attack must submit to the scrutiny of a doctor's examination immediately following any official report. It's not surprising that the news headline the next day read,
"No more genuine attacks. A anesthetist reported."
Were there in fact no more attacks? Or were the victims holding back their accounts due to the fact that they were now scared to be examined and labeled lunatics themselves by the police and the paper? The final reported and last attack of the Mad Gasser occurred on September 13th. This attack was probably the most unusual. Miss Bertha Bench and her son Orville were attacked in their home. They reported that the attacker was a woman who was dressed in a man's clothing and who sprayed gas in their bedroom window. The next morning, footprints that appeared to have been made by a woman's high-heel shoes were found in the dirt below the window. What is so strange is that after this attack, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon simply disappeared and was never seen or heard of again. As quickly as it all started, it ended, making many people wonder if it even happened at all. And while the identity of the attacker still remains a mystery, there are a few theories that may explain what happened and who the attacker may have been. All right, Jess, that's the story. What do you think about that?
It seems pretty fantastic that something like that could happen in modern America. Even though it's 1944, it's still pretty modern.
Yeah, it definitely is a wild story. There's no doubt about it. So some of the theories that have been put forth to kind of explain this whole scenario include things like toxic waste. This was kind of the main theory that was put out by the actual police force of Mattoon. And this was actually put out by Police Chief Cole. And he put this out in a press conference on September the 12th. And part of this theory included blaming a local manufacturing company by the name of Atlas Imperial Diesel. In this statement, he said,
"Local police, in cooperation with the state officers, have checked and rechecked all reported cases," said Chief Cole, "and we find absolutely no evidence to support the theories that have been told. Hysteria must be blamed for such seemingly accurate statements of supposed victims. However, we have found that large quantities of carbon tetrachloride are used in the war work done at the Atlas Imperial Company, and that it has an odor which could be carried in all parts of the city as the wind shifts. It also leaves stains on cloth, such as those found on the rag of the Cordes home."
What I find interesting about this particular statement, Jessica, is that it's very contradictory to what Cole was previously stating, was that, this was all hysteria and there was all nonsense and there was really nothing to it. But now he is kind of backtracking and he's kind of suggesting that the gas and the symptoms were both real. Of course, the Atlas Imperial Company refuted these claims and accusations and put out a statement in which they said that the only tetrachloride and trichloroethylene that they had was contained within fire extinguishers, and that it would take much more than what they had to impact a town the size of Mattoon. Police Chief Cole thereafter retracted his statement about Atlas and said the fumes may not have come from Atlas factory, but could have come from any of the local factories. So it certainly seems at this point that the local police department is grasping at straws.
Yeah, it seems like they don't know what they're talking about, but they're trying to make stuff up to appease the crowds.
Willing to point the finger, it seems, at any local company that had any chemicals on board at all.
Yeah, they didn't even know what the chemicals were in the first place that were causing this. They just were kind of guessing.
Exactly. Certainly not evidence, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The other kind of main theory that's been presented by several psychologists who believe that the events in Mattoon were nothing more than mass hysteria. So, Jessica, what is mass hysteria?
Well, I'm no expert, but mass hysteria is related to something called conversion disorder. The conversion disorder is where a person experiences something physical like blindness, paralysis, or other symptoms that affect the nervous system, but that cannot be explained solely by physical illness or injury. The symptoms usually begin suddenly after a period of emotional or physical distress. This kind of makes sense for Mattoon. They were obviously under a lot of physical stress with all of the newspaper articles and people being gassed. They could take these and literally cause physical symptoms because of this.
Yeah, and specialists who study this phenomena describe it as a type of psychogenic illness, a condition that begins in the mind rather than in the body. The funny thing about this is that the psychological symptoms are not an illusion, but they're actually very real. This makes it very different from other types of mental illness, such as schizophrenia, which has both auditory and visual types of hallucinations, but does not present as actual physical illnesses such as blindness or paralysis. Occurrences of mass hysteria certainly are not rare.
Yeah, they've been recorded ever since medieval times. They even happen today.
Yeah, many people would tell you that this whole COVID-19 pandemic is nothing more than mass hysteria.
I don't think so.
Yet to be determined.
If you look this topic up online, you'll find some pretty interesting stories.
Yeah, there definitely are some interesting stories out there about mass hysteria. Maybe worth a future podcast. So it's probably not surprising that the media tends to play a huge role in these mass hysteria type of events. Typically what happens is that the media will build up a story, then they'll kind of pull it down real quickly. Very similar to the events that occurred in Mattoon. So in Mattoon, it was the Mattoon Daily Journal Gazette, the city's newspaper, that was kind of stoking all of this event. It was their articles and their editorials that were believed to be causing a unjustified fear among the population. Yet it was the same paper that like 2 weeks later that just tried to convince the citizens that, hey, there's nothing here, just move on, go on about your daily business.
Makes you question your trust in the media.
Oh yeah, definitely. You should always have distrust in the media, in my opinion.
This particular incident that happened in Mattoon actually had a research paper written about it. Donald Johnson, he was a psychology student from the University of Illinois. He basically researched this phenomenon extensively and reported his findings in a paper he wrote for the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology in 1945. His research has been cited in many textbooks, and he basically claimed that this was a classic study of mass hysteria. His conclusion was, the front page story was the immediate cause for what became mass hysteria, creating a perfect storm for the tale to grow from there.
Yeah, there was another researcher, his name was Robert Bartholomew. He has also studied the events in Mattoon extensively and wrote about them in several scholarly journals. Bartholomew says that the nearly 2 weeks of media coverage from the Journal Gazette showed how the story was stoked and then extinguished by the media. He stated, the media first reported about it uncritically. The way it was reported, it looked like it would be real, and it became real. Then it was treated more skeptically. All these investigators were on the case, even the FBI, but nothing was found. The media certainly created a heightened awareness, and this heightened awareness is likely what triggered the what many believe to be a mass hysteria event. There are a couple of wilder stories that or theories that have come out regarding this. One of those is that possibly our own government had been testing chemical weapons on the population of Mattoon. I will say that, why this is a theory, there is absolutely no evidence supporting this theory in any way, shape, or form, and should not really be considered probable or even likely. I gotta say this next one is my favorite.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I like to read it and report it just because of how out there it is.
It's, certainly, again, not likely or probable, but it certainly is an interesting take on the whole scenario.
Exactly. It's the ape man with a gas gun.
At least one Mattoon citizen made a wild report about an ape man that she claimed shot her with a gas gun that induced paralysis. This report came from Edna James, and she reported that on September the 7th, she woke up to some clattering that was going on in her kitchen, and when she investigated, she discovered that there was an ape man with stooped shoulders, exceedingly long arms, and facial warts standing in her kitchen. When the strange creature spotted her, it let out a series of unrecognizable grunts, and it then turned around and shot her with a gas gun that caused her to pass out from paralysis. She also claims that a few days later that she saw the same creature again that was just casually walking across the lobby of her house. When the creature noticed Edna looking at it again, it just kind of poof and disappeared.
That is an amazing story.
I think that when this is all said and done, I'm going to believe that this was likely done by an ape man with a gas gun.
Was the ape man wearing a gas mask too? Or just have a gun?
I did not say anything about a gas mask, just
Okay.
a gas gun. So you may have noticed at this point that there are no actual theories to suggest that there was an actual gasser. Jess, do you think that there may have been an actual gasser?
I think it's a probable theory that there could be actually a person who is experimenting and gassing people.
I think that, it actually is probable that there was an actual gasser, especially with the first two cases. The first two cases, I don't think would qualify as that
Mass hysteria.
Mass hysteria type event. You had Urban Rafe, who had an experience in his home late at night and really wasn't going to tell anyone about it because he thought it was, unusual. But then he kind of read about it in the paper the next morning and read that someone else had the same attack and decided that it was time that he needed to report that. I think that the first two cases, definitely support that there's the possibility that there was actually a real gasser.
And if you take into account and consider the first two stories authentic, then how can you really say that the other stories aren't authentic either?
Well, in many ways they are authentic because they are all sharing a very similar experience. Other than this wild gas monkey, everyone reported very similar symptoms. They all reported a sweet-smelling gas. They all reported nausea. They all reported that their throats burned, their mouth was dry, and they
paralysis.
all reported paralysis. I think that the fact that all of the reports were very similar indicates that this may not have been a mass hysteria event.
And on top of that, I think the only reason why they consider it a mass hysteria event is that there was no physical proof. Well, there are gases that you can be exposed to that within a few minutes can dissipate, and there is no physical proof.
Exactly. There's at least one author who does believe that there was a actual gasser, and this author's name is Scott Maruna. And Scott has written a book on this topic, and it's called The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, Dispelling the Hysteria. Maruna believes that the real culprit of the gassing was a person in town by the name of Farley Llewellyn. He was a local alcoholic chemist who was known to have a lab in the basement of his parents' house. Maruna's theory is it's wild. It does include some speculation of things like homosexuality, government cover-up, and complicity and accessory of the Llewellyn family. So I think it needs to be taken skeptically, but it is an interesting theory. Maruna's book states that Farley was the son of a local grocer, and while his family was highly respected, Farley never really fit in the community very well. Farley was thought by the community to be very odd and different, and certainly what most people would describe as a reclusive loner. Although he was highly intelligent and he excelled in school, no one really understood him. Maruna goes on to insinuate that the town really never accepted Farley because he was a homosexual. Farley attended the University of Illinois, and he was a chemistry major. When he returned to Mattoon, he became even more reclusive and introverted and distant, and spent most of his time in a full-scale chemistry laboratory that he had built in his family's basement. Farley was also reported to be a heavy drinker and was known around town as a alcoholic. One of the things that Maruna found interesting about Farley was that a couple of days before these attacks occurred, there was a explosion in the lab that he had in his parents' home. This was reported by a neighbor. Maruna believes that the explosion occurred while Farley was testing the gas he would later use to torment the local residents. He believes that Farley's true intent was to blow up the town. Maruna also believes that the gas that Farley used was probably nitromethane. It's a sweet-smelling gas that's clear. It's highly volatile, and it can cause nausea, burning of the mouth, swelling of the lips, and minimal eye irritation. He also states that because nitromethane evaporates quickly, little to no evidence would be left behind for the police to find after the attacks. This certainly matches many of the victims' accounts of a sweet-smelling gas and corroborates that the gas smell could not be detected within a few minutes after the attacks. Maruna's theory also states that Farley was an actual suspect right from the very beginning, but that the police refused to act on the information. The reason behind this was that, according to Maruna, it was purely out of respect for Farley's family, primarily his father. As we mentioned before, he was a prominent local grocer. If this is true, it certainly implies that the local police were complicit in a possible cover-up. There's also another interesting twist, according to Maruna's theory.
Yeah, Farley was actually being surveilled by the police, and under the surveillance, the attacks continued. So they pretty much figured he wasn't a relevant suspect. However, Maruna has an idea for this. He says that while he was under police surveillance, his sisters didn't really want him to get caught, so his sister Florence and Catherine Llewellyn, they assumed the role of the Mad Gasser, and they carried out the last final few attacks in an effort to clear their brother's name. Maruna suggests that this is why the high heel footprints were found at least one of the scenes.
Maruna also believes it was Farley because the attacks abruptly ended once the Llewellyn family locked Farley in a basement and then sent him off to a state mental institution for the insane. This assumption is actually corroborated by at least one more source. Local writer Troy Taylor states that he was sent a letter in 2002 from a woman who shared a story of her father who actually grew up in Mattoon during the time that this was all going on. The letter states, "My father grew up in Mattoon during the time where the gas attacks were taking place. He told me that there had been 2 sisters living in town at the time who had a brother who was allegedly insane. A number of people in town believed that he was the Mad Gasser, and so his sisters locked him in the basement until they could find a mental institution to put him in. After they locked him away, her father told her the gas attacks stopped." While Farley is certainly a convenient culprit, there is certainly no actual evidence that he was the Mad Gasser. Everything that Maruna purports is purely conjecture and speculation, and while this theory is interesting, it does little to solve the actual mystery of who the Mad Gasser of Mattoon may have been.
Yeah, the story makes sense from a historical perspective, but it's not really evidence-based, and it's accusing real people without the proper evidence.
Exactly. So without a doubt, the fall of 1944 was strange times for the sleepy town of Mattoon, Illinois. Certainly, no one expected Mattoon to be the host to so many odd and mysterious circumstances. Was there a madman lurking in the neighborhoods, gassing unsuspecting citizens in their homes? Was it Nazis? Was it toxic waste? Was it mass hysteria? Or was it something else entirely? Sadly, we may never know, as time and evidence are no longer on our side. Ultimately, all we are left with the events in Mattoon is nothing more than a mystery. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of this episode. Jessica, any final thoughts before we end?
Yeah, this is definitely an interesting story, and I love that no matter where you live, even in central Illinois, you can find interesting stories if you do a little research.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us, guys. All right, folks, that's the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you listening. If you have enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. And remember, if you've had a paranormal experience that you would like to share, please email us at prairielandparanormalpodcast@gmail.com or visit our website at prairielandparanormalpodcast.com. So until next time, remember, don't be normal when you can be paranormal.